Over the last several weeks, I've been doing a series of video teachings called Raised in Church. This is one of them. And I'd like to respond very briefly to some of the comments and maybe questions that have been asked regarding that series. First of all, I'm not trying to get anybody to stop going to church. That's not the point. I'm not trying to get people to sell their buildings or abandon their buildings or throw away their money. That's not the point. Those of us who see Christianity from more of an organic perspective are just concerned about the spiritual condition of the church, because if that is right, then what we are going to see is a healthy church. Whether it meets in a building or a house or a backyard, it makes no difference. Whether it has no money involved in it or it deals with a lot of funds, whether it has people in leadership designated in very specific titles and positions, or whether it has none of that. The idea is to bring the church into a spiritual relationship with Jesus Christ like it was in those first chapters of Acts. We mainly read that very well in Acts chapters 2 through 17. Well, James, who was one of the apostles, writes great articles of wisdom to us, and one of those is in the very first chapter that he writes in his epistle. And those verses are often taken out of context or used to say what the preacher, pastor, denomination, board of directors wanted to say, and that's not what we should ever read the Bible for. We talked about that in our last session, and that's important. If you didn't get a chance to see that one, go back and take a look at it. He writes in James chapter 1, verses 19 through 22, "You know this, my beloved brothers and sisters. Now everyone must be quick to hear." And that's an interesting phrase, because quick to hear means we listen accurately, and we listen to it now. We don't put it off. Okay? It says quick to hear, slow to speak. Slow to speak simply means we really think about our words as they come out, how they would reflect the words of Christ, the life of Christ, the morals of Christ, the biblical principles. We think about what we say first. We don't just pop off an answer, pop off a response because we feel we've got to even up the score, or we've got to turn the tables, or whatever that might be. Then he goes on to say, "And be slow to anger, for a man's anger does not bring about righteousness of God." So many preachers are out there angry. So many people are out there angry in the church. I'm not talking about outside of the church. In the church. And they're fighting each other, and they get angry and mad about little tiny things. And that anger they feel is godly anger. And it's really not. It's their anger. Because they don't want people to do things differently than they do, or they want everyone to believe exactly like they do. And sometimes that anger is disguised very well behind a calm face. But our anger will never bring the righteousness of God. It says that right here. And he says, "Therefore, ridding yourselves of all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness." That means we got to clean our own house first, and that starts individually, and then congregationally, and then from there on out into the church at large. We have to start in our own lives, cleaning out what he calls filthiness, what he calls wickedness. You say, Christians, filthy, wicked? Oh yes, I've pastored 3 churches. I've seen it firsthand. I've seen it in my own life. And when I preach and when I teach these things, you have to recognize I'm not perfect either. None of us are, but we have to move forward. We have to go where we need to go. And you say, "Well, Joe, it sounds to me like you want people to go back to the book of Acts and live like that." No, not in the flesh, but in the spirit, because that's the way Christ intended it to be. That's why the Holy Spirit came in Acts chapter 2 and birthed that spiritual life within those 110 to 120 people gathered together there. Well, he says after we should get rid of all this filthiness, all this wickedness. And this is basically speaking to us of the world. The world comes in our lives and makes us who we are, and that's sad because we let it happen that way. And then he goes on to say, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. That is really, really powerful stuff. First of all, humility is not sitting around going, I'm no good, I'm no worth nothing. That's not what it is at all. Humility is simply recognizing your relationship with God in perspective. He is creator. We are the creation, and the creator is always greater than the creation. Therefore, we have a perspective of our relationship. That is humility. And he says if we receive that in the word that he's given us, that will save our souls. In other words, when we understand our relationship with God through Jesus Christ because of his death, burial, and resurrection, we are living humble lives in that perspective. And then he goes on to say, but prove yourselves doers of the word and not just hearers who deceive themselves. You know, when all we do is hear, it equates to personal deception. We talked about this before. We often read the Bible for what we want it to say to us and not what it's really saying. We need to be hearers of the word and doers of the word. And when we are doers of the word, that insinuates and gives us credentials in the experience of how we live out our faith. That's really, really powerful, because experience proves who we are. See, most people just go to church on Sunday mornings and they give God an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours if they go to Sunday school, and then at 12 noon, by the time they walk out of the church building, we're back to normal. And until about 9:30, 10 o'clock the next Sunday, they live their lives like everybody else. 90% of the people who walk into church do that, with rare exception, congregationally. That's about the truth. Well, it's interesting because we define Christianity as the church, and it's not. It's just totally not. The church is the called out ones, the ecclesia. That's why we call the study of the church ecclesiology. And the church is not Christianity. It holds Christianity, but it's not equal to. And that's the problem. We think, I go to church, I volunteer some time, I give money, I be a good little boy and girl on Sunday morning. I'm cool, I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian. I can live like I want to from 12 noon on Sunday until the following Sunday about 9 in the morning. Maybe even Wednesday night or something, I might go to church a little bit. It's really interesting because when I was in seminary, one of our preaching professors said, you will probably plant about 8 words out of your sermon into most of the people's minds. And he says, that's about a sentence or sentence and a half. And he says, and what's funny about it is, by Tuesday night, they won't remember it. And that's why a lot of churches have a Wednesday night service to try to stir it back up. I think. I'm not sure. But that's the whole gist of the situation. Okay? And therein lies the problem. We don't listen sharply. We don't listen accurately, and then we don't do it. We don't live it out. I catch myself doing this. So I'm not saying I'm any fine example of this. This is where we have to go collectively as the church. Well, it all boils down to one big problem, and here is the problem. We won't stand up for righteousness by how we live, by what we say. We just don't stand up for righteousness. The church right now here in North America has let the culture come into it in a great measure, and we are entertainers for the most part. We are not in any way, shape, or form really getting down to the nitty-gritty and discipling people how to live on a daily basis. And that's the leadership fault. But it's also the people who don't hear and then do. Okay, so it's all of us together. Okay. The problem is when sin and the culture and all these things from the society come into the church and take over the church, as it has, especially here in North America, we have one problem. And the one problem is the core issue right here. And it's this. We will not say no. We gladly tolerate people because we want to live at peace with everybody. We don't want friction. We don't want confrontation. And confrontation, when it's done right, is not angry and is not mad. It's biblical. Okay? Hebrews 12:14 is a verse we lift out of context because it says, we're supposed to live peaceably with all men as much as possible. Well, you've got to read that in context who he's talking to there. You can't just lift that out and say, well, that's why we'll just tolerate it. We won't make waves. We won't rock the boat. We'll just tolerate it. We know how we believe. That's the honest thing. We will not say no to the world systems coming into the church. We will not say no to blatant sin existing in the church, and it does. And if you've been around churches much, you know that. Now, there again, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and walk away. You let God work and use you and others to refine and restore the church to what it should be. We will not say no to non-Christ-like attitudes. Here are 3 of them. First one, self-preservation. I got to survive this. I got to look good. The second one is self-exaltation. Look at me. See what I've done? These are non-Christ-like attitudes. Christ did not preserve himself. He sacrificed himself. Christ did not exalt himself. He allowed himself to undergo much misery. And he didn't do it to get attention. And when he did the miraculous works many times, they were very secluded and very privately. He wasn't out to make a show. He wasn't out to make television reels. That's not it at all. The last one is greed. I want. It's not a Christ-like attitude either. We won't say no to that. We just let that happen all around us in all of our congregations, all the time. And last, then we won't say no to biblical, immoral practices. This includes adultery, fornication, abortion, euthanasia. And yes, there is euthanasia. Those of you who don't know it, you need to wake up. I've been a licensed funeral director for over 4 decades. I know there is. We all know that. And of course, warmongering and the such are all immoral practices that contradict biblical principles. And the last thing is, we will not say no to political biases, and the church is greatly divided over political biases. We are not Americans first. We are citizens of the kingdom of God, and he is the king. We didn't elect him. Okay? We are his constituents. We are citizens of his kingdom. The rest of it doesn't matter. Oh, yes, it does. No, it doesn't. And one day, when each one of us steps into eternity, we'll realize that. We have to face that. We have to say no to our political biases. So, what do we have here? Well, we have some very good instruction of what organic Christianity truly is. And I hope we can learn this from James. I hope you'll read this over and let this come into your heart and grow richly in you as you mature in your faith in Jesus Christ.